on. Please proceed. Randy, you kicking us off?
Nope. Tom, you want to go first?
Yeah, I'm Tom Colett. I'm with Laborers Local 483. We represent workers in the city of Portland, and specifically workers at Portland Parks and Recreation. This measure affects a huge amount of the members we represent, and an even larger amount of the workers at parks, who represent about 44% of the city's workforce, if you look at raw numbers. Parks is one of the most diverse bureaus, so we have about 3% of the bureau are people of color, and 56% of the bureau are female workers. And with COVID-19 that recently occurred, we have seen a lot of job loss. So over 1,700 people in that bureau have lost their jobs. And if we're not able to get parks back on firm footing, which is what this measure does and why we're here to support it, there could be hundreds of other workers who lose those jobs. Not only that, the Parks Bureau is a pipeline for many people to get full-time work with the city. A lot of folks who may not have the skills or the degrees to get those jobs off the street come to work for the Parks Bureau, and they migrate and make their way into all the other bureaus in the city of Portland, PBOT, BES, BDS, et cetera. So we view this as not just important for parks, but also important for access to living wage jobs for people across Portland.
Okay, so this is the Portland Parks Levy. It would provide, and I'm Randy Gregg with Portland Parks Foundation. This is the Portland Parks Levy. It would provide $48 million a year for 5 years with an assessment of 80 cents per thousand assessed value. That's about $13 per month for the average homeowner. And I want to back up a little bit and talk about the overall picture of parks. 11,000 acres, 470 facilities. That includes community centers, 10 swimming pools, world-class gardens, arts classes, daycare, summer camps, nature education, and of course, all the actual parks we see around in our neighborhoods with tennis and futsal and basketball and baseball and soccer fields. To give you a sense of the use of these parks, 253 athletic user groups, leagues and teams log in about 193,000 hours of time in parks facilities. In a normal summer, Portland Parks and Recreation puts on dozens of free movies and concerts and other cultural events for families and parks, jazz concert at Washington Park, to the first Tongan dance festival in the country, to movies like Finding Nemo, dubbed in Navajo in Colett Park. Now, a little known fact about Portland Parks and Recreation is that they also provide a lot of free lunches to kids who are enrolled in the school, in the normal school lunch program, but in the summer would otherwise go hungry. In a normal summer, Portland Parks and Recreation provides about 90,000 lunches. And this summer they provided 500,000. Keep in mind that Portland Parks Rangers are often the frontline contact with those living outside. And then there's the whole nature part of our system, which includes 8,000 acres of natural areas, watersheds, and 1.2 million trees. This is really the heart and soul of our city. Many people move here for it. It's the first thing they fall in love with is the park system. But we've got two really big problems. One has been a decade in the making, and then there's the one that's been wrought by the crisis of the pandemic. There's a long-term structural deficit caused by Portland Parks and Recreation's reliance on fees. 27 cents of every dollar is earned through rec fees and permits for events and tree permits and that kind of thing. And the maintenance needs of a 100-year-old system and the growing cost of equitable wages and health insurance those are just growing faster than the general fund allocations and Parks and Recreation fees can bear. As you guys reported on last year, a reckoning came with about a 7% cut, $6.4 million. But the longer slide has been going on for the last decade. I've sat on the Budget Advisory Council for, I think, 5 years now. And, we've been watching this sort of slow degradation. To give you an example, our population grew by 13% in the last 10 years, and the new development funded the building of about 5 large parks, but the park's maintenance staff has been cut by 11%. For those 400 facilities, the Bureau has 3 electricians. We have 12 arborists maintaining that 1.2 million trees. So that's 1 arborist per 100,000 trees. We have 18 horticulturalists maintaining an average of 11 parks each. Their average budget for new plants per park across the system is about $100. So Nick Fish formed a task force to study this problem when he inherited it. And I sat on that, and we projected out 15 years and discovered that costs would likely increase by about 16%, while the general fund allocations and fees would probably only grow by 5% at historic levels. And with no change in this picture, we would see a gradual closing of facilities, 1 out of 4, actually, over the course of 15 years. And just to maintain these existing facilities, this is not even really adding anything, would necessitate 50% more funding. So we looked at numerous revenue streams, additional taxes on food and beverages, lodging, cell phones among them. And Nick convened a November work session with council, and the mayor suggested adding a high income tax to the mix. And, you know, as Nick's way, he was being very methodical and, you know, slowly weighing the next steps. But he died, and then COVID-19 hit, and the community centers and programs closed, and suddenly none of those fees that were providing 27 cents on the dollar were being collected. And so, you know, presto, our park system's slow slide, you know, became a plunge off a cliff. $16 million for this fiscal year. So if we don't backfill that, our parks and rec system is going to be unrecognizable, even less maintenance, substantially fewer rec programs, right when we need them most, whether you're a kid wanting to learn to swim or a senior in need of exercise and seeing your friends, a mom who needs some time away from her kids to get some work done. It'll mean 17 fewer jobs, as Tom said. PPR is the largest employer of summer employer of youth in the city. And so with this crisis, the mayor and Portland Parks and Recreation decided that action was needed, and it needed to happen fast. And when the idea of this levy for November first came out, I thought it was crazy. I mean, there's a lot of money, you know, issues that we knew even then were going to be on the ballot. Why not go for May? But if we did that, PPR would not have the money and time to hire for next summer. And so even as we adapt to the pandemic or get a vaccine, all the rec centers and swimming pools and such would be shuttered.
Randy, can you just clarify for a second? So
Sure
this is a renewal, correct, or not?
No, it's a new tax. It's a new thing.
Don't you have an expiring levy next year?
No.
We passed the bond in 2014. Todd may know offhand when that rolls off, but that was just 2014.
There's only been one levy. It was like back in the 90s, and it was for a tiny amount of money. Okay. So this is an entirely new thing.
Okay.
So to give you a sense, you have other questions, or should I go on?
I do. I'm a little confused about what happened to the 27-cent collection. Nick Fish died, and people just forgot to collect it?
No, COVID shut down all the programs, the community centers, and all of the means of generating that.
So sorry, you said he died, and then you said the next thing that happened was that there wasn't any money, and I just couldn't figure out the logic.
Yeah, sorry, I may have just gone over that too quickly.
That makes much more sense now. Please.
Okay, good. All right. So I'll tell you about a little bit about what it's going to do, and then we can go to questions. So the levy is going to backfill the crisis. It'll reopen the rec centers and programs. It's going to reverse the long-standing maintenance decline in parks and natural spaces. It'll assure Multnomah Arts Center, IFCC, and other community centers won't close. And it'll provide operational funding for Columbia Pool and eventually for the pool that replaces it. And then a really important thing is it's going to go one step farther and create more equitable access to all the rec programs for all Portlanders through free and sliding scale programs for folks facing financial challenges. So that's a big move. It's a big equity move. As I said before, it's 80 cents per thousand assessed value. And I can only say the levy enjoys one of the widest sets of endorsements of any money measure. You know, we've got frontline community groups like Verde and Apano, environmental groups, Audubon and OLCV, little groups like Brown Folks Fishing, and then the major business organizations like Portland Business Alliance and Home Builders of Metropolitan Portland. You know, it's not a wealth tax, it's spread evenly. And it's also really not buying anything new. It's preserving a system we have and one that we cherish, and unfortunately for too long we've taken for granted. And we're going to simply make it more accessible for more people.
So, Randy, thanks for that. The group that Fish convened in November that you were part of, as you said, this is not a new issue. The financial struggles that the Parks Bureau has faced are not a new issue. And, you know, you call the structural deficit, and in essence, expenses have been larger than revenues or grown faster than revenues. So it's great that we are considering adding new revenue, but could you talk about what steps Parks has taken to address its expense line?
Todd, do you feel good about addressing that? Because I mean, there was a real tightening of the belt last year with the $6.4 million in cuts. And I think Todd can talk more articulately about specifically what was done.
Yeah, so first just to address the structural problem between the expenses and the revenues. So by having personnel costs like healthcare costs or PERS costs that have inflationary factors higher, then we're able to raise fees to keep our programs affordable. That's the widening gap that we're one of the things that we're trying to solve for. And so we did a reduction, as Randy said, almost $7 million a little over a year ago, and that closed that gap temporarily, but that gap would reopen again because, again, the inflationary costs on personnel grow faster than we raise our fees. And in some cases, it's not that you can just raise your fees forever. Like our fee at Southwest Community Center for like a monthly pass is more expensive than you could get at 24 Hour Fitness already. So there's a ceiling on, and we operate in a private marketplace for some of our services. At the same time, we have an equity goal of making sure our programs are affordable, and we haven't had a dedicated scholarship program, so that's limited our access. Some of the other ways of where we've kept our expenses down and tried to leverage the public investment is through making sure that we have a robust volunteer program, and we have almost 200 friends and partner groups that either operate buildings for us, provide services, do park cleanup exercises. It's almost about $5 million worth of volunteer and gifted in-kind labor to the park system every year by these volunteer groups. So that's another way where we've kind of made the dollar stretch, the general fund dollar that's given to us stretch. But this overdependence on program fees is really what caused the more acute short-term problem of where Aaron was asking about a $35 million recreation program. 15 of it was being paid by swim lesson fees and fitness fees, and that's gone now. So now you're left with about a $20 million recreation program. And so that's where the levy will be able to correct that.
Is there a U.S. city that Portland Parks and Rec looks at and says that's the funding model, or that's the model of parks, capital and maintenance expenditures and fundraising that we would like to emulate?
So we've called, with Commissioner Fish's leadership, this effort Sustainable Future. So it's about aligning the expectations of the community and city council with available resources. And so we've been out of balance for a while. That's why we've had so many conversations year after year about what's going to happen with park services. And so we've looked across the country, places like Seattle, even locally here, Tualatin Hills, where you can have dedicated funding sources to predict over more than 1 year budget, to have stable funding so you can level set the services you provide to the available resources.
Is that essentially like a park improvement district or a separate parks taxation?
So we've looked at different examples. So in the state, that was one of the reasons we've looked at food and beverage tax. Some park systems use a food and beverage tax to help pay for their park system. In addition to everyone uses some general fund, some general tax dollars to pay for their park system. There's also been examples of lodging taxes used. Parks District is one. We have a unique example or rules in state of Oregon where the city government can't be the body that oversees a parks district. So without some state law change, it would be an independent body or the county. But we did do that research, and that could be more of a medium-term option, but would require probably some state law change for the city of Portland City Council to be the parks district body.
So is this, you didn't say so, but is this approach a 5-year bond sort of a stopgap measure short of what would be optimal, or what did your analysis tell you in the end?
Well, I mean, it's, the political playing field is, constantly changing. I mean, the goal was a long-term, study and to, come up with a, possibly a cocktail of solutions that would solve this problem long-term, because there's also a capital needs, side of it. The crisis made this, essential to move forward with something. Otherwise, as I mentioned, things are going to look a lot different, and they're going to look a lot different fast, like next year. Next summer will not be it'll look like this summer, even if COVID is behind us. So we moved forward with the levy. It pulled well. We also looked at a bond, but the levy pulled better, and the levy solved the more immediate need of the funding crisis. It buys us 5 years of time, new parks commissioner. We can get our feet on the ground and look out at the horizon and look at things more seriously, like a parks district or another set of funding measures. It definitely buys 5 years of time.
I noticed in the voters pamphlet statement, obviously there is no opposition here today, but one of the objections that I believe the Taxpayer Association of Oregon raised was the expense, and they referenced, I think, a 2017 Trust for Public Lands document that said that our park system is relatively expensive compared to other cities. Can one of you address that? Is that the case, or have you benchmarked us against other cities?
Todd, you guys did some benchmarking against that.
Yeah, so it's really a lot of those numbers are kind of an apples and oranges comparison. So not every park system is created equally. As Randy mentioned, Portland Parks and Recreation is a 100-year-old system. You go to Nevada, you'll get a newer system that's cheaper in the short term to maintain, but will have long-term capital maintenance problems, challenges, just like we have today. And then there's not a standard level of service either of what you provide. So not every city wants to provide free lunches to their kids in their parks. Not every city wants to have a teen program that's free for kids after school. So it's hard to have those comparisons. When we look at our peer cities like San Francisco and Seattle, we feel like, we're within the industry standard, if you will, with similar cities that have kind of a similar value framework.
There's also the sheer acreage. I mean, we're in, the upper echelon of just acres per, per person. unfortunately unequally distributed in the city, with the west side having, way more park space than east side. But it's a, it's a fact. We are well parked in the larger picture of things.
I should know the answer to this question, but I don't, so I'll ask it. There has been a tremendous amount of development in the city over the past 5 years, say, or pick any period, which contributes a lot to system development charges. Some or most of that money goes to parks. Todd, can you talk about where that money has gone? Is there a surplus of SDC money sitting somewhere in a reserve account, or what's happened with it?
Yeah, so there's been a lot of growth in the city, as you said, and the system development charge is developed to grow with that growth, right? So make sure that we're growing the park system to maintain the level of service that we had prior to the growth. And so new parks are being built in the city, old parks are being enhanced, so we have more capacity to serve more people. So Park Lane Park, for instance, Gateway Discovery Park, parts of Portland that we haven't had, park service before, new parks have been built. And then, as I mentioned, old parks, examples are like taking grass sports field and turning them into synthetic turfs so they can serve more kids. And rather than 600 hours of play, you can get 3,000 hours of play in a year. So those types of projects are underway every year, and we're thankful for that. The levy will help make sure that those new parks are taken care of. As Randy mentioned, we've been on resource constraint over the last decade or so. And so the care and maintenance of those parks has been declining. So the levy will make sure that when we open new parks in East Portland, they'll be taken care of, they'll be well maintained, and the life of the asset, whether it's a 20 or 50-year improvement, we'll make sure we'll get 20 or 50 years, where if you don't do that preventive maintenance, as you know, they'll have a shorter life.
So the SDC money has been spent. It's not sitting somewhere in a reserve account on the balance sheet for a rainy day.
So when we get the SDCs that come in on an annual basis, then we do an annual allocation, and every year we're allocating the dollars, not all of the dollars, because we keep some of the dollars for larger projects. So we'll save up over multiple years to do a larger project. But happy to send you the last 5-year allocation. It's an active program.
Yeah. Randy, I think you live in the Laurelhurst neighborhood. Not to make this personal, but I've noticed I often visit that park, and the pond there, which is kind of a highlight of the park, has been covered with a thick blanket of green scum all summer. It's made me wonder if there's a little bit of a Washington Monument strategy going on here, whether that extremely visible lack of maintenance or lack of proper care of the pond is designed to help people vote for this levy.
Well, I actually live in Buckman, but I'm on the edge
Okay.
of Laurelhurst, and I go there quite a bit. And it turns green every year. But I think it is worse this year for sure. Todd, I don't know if you can address that specifically. I know that there's been pump issues and things there for a long time.
I'm happy to look into it and give you the answer back. I'm not sure what the issue there is.
But it does turn green every year.
I would just say
that it looks greener this year.
I would just say that the resources to maintain parks have been stretched for a while. So the people who take care of those parks are park techs, maintenance mechanics. And as Portland has grown and we've gotten more parks on the east side, which I think is an equity imperative, we've also seen as well that we've seen a reduction in the number of people doing those jobs. And that's kind of part of the long-term problem we're having. You also look at, the way the parks are being used now, there's more stress on the park system. So, more folks from the houseless population, more things going on at the parks, more people getting out, because with COVID, that's one of the few places where you can safely recreate. So I do know from a long-term maintenance standpoint, talking to folks who are members who do that work, they're always coming to me and saying, hey, we wish we had more help. We're getting stretched thinner and thinner and thinner.
Okay. So what's the backup plan? I mean, as you said, this polls very well, but what if this fails?
Well, there'll be a lot of belt tightening, and it's pretty severe. I have a grid that tells some of the examples of things that will be. There's basically currently no funding plan that would enable the opening of all pools, and most definitely Columbia Pool would remain closed because it's a high maintenance little effort there, keeping it going for as long as it possibly can. The community centers will not be able to be opened at any kind of traditional level of service. Trash pickup would be cut back to once a week, and only the ones that are overflowing sort of prioritized. Decreased maintenance. I'm kind of looking at this, with the levy, without levy grid. Bathroom maintenance down to once a week as opposed to daily. There's just a variety of belt tightening. As I said before, I don't think, certainly not for, next year things will look different, but it will be a very rapid decline in our park system without this levy.
Mark Sussman, you've got a question, you're muted.
I do. This is a little bit of a long ball, but bear with me, and I guess this question is for Todd and Rand. COVID has accelerated a lot of changes throughout all of our lives, and a lot of them are changes that are going to stick with us after we've got a vaccine and hopefully after this election goes the right way. The police department is going to be completely reformed. There's already talk about potentially merging the sheriff's department with the police department after the election. Obviously, that's been driven a lot by protests, but I'm just wondering, as an institution, have you folks taken advantage of the challenges of COVID to think about how to change with the time? So in the case of government efficiency, for example, why shouldn't Metro take over all city parks?
So I can speak to that a little bit because we represent workers at Metro. They have an incredible budget crunch right now. And there's also an incredible budget crunch.
I'm not suggesting they're going to take over parks and not have any money. I'm saying from a point of view of government efficiency, doesn't it make sense to have regional government be responsible for parks in the region? I dare say that if I asked you how many people from outside of Portland come to Portland parks, the percentage is probably pretty substantial, or the number of Portlanders who go to Clackamas County and go to parks. So, this is sort of Earl Blumenauer's vision. Why not rethink the way Parks is funded? Why should there even be a Parks Foundation, for God's sake?
Parks Foundation?
Why should this be an operation of a regional government rather than a city fiefdom?
Well, that's a big question, Mark. There's something called the Intertwine Alliance that is, basically pulls together all of the, parks organizations across the entire region. Metro is kind of the convener of that. But the diversity of groups and the diversity of issues and, the differences differences in watersheds, the differences in populations. I mean, this is an inner city population. I mean, Metro is, moving towards things like, regional solutions to, or not solutions, but at least biting off pieces of housing and homelessness. But the complexity, the sheer number of programs that PPR does, the role it plays as essential infrastructure in this city's, both livability and survivability, that kind of transition, you just can't wave a wand and make it happen. It's a very, very complex little instrument that, needs to be, nurtured on its own terms. Portland's, East Portland's problems are very different than Tualatin's problems or Beaverton's problems.
Well, East Portland's problems are completely different from the problems in the West Side, but we don't have an East Side Parks Bureau, West Side Parks Bureau.
I would say, Mark, that like I would just kind of answer at a practical level, because I think at a larger level, like that's an interesting thing to consider, and I think there's some good points there. But the sense of urgency we have, and what's going to happen to this system if we don't create this fix in the near term, kind of necessitates us moving on a faster path than a larger conversation like that would allow for. Because to be able to do a handoff like that and intergovernmental agreements that would be required to make something like that happen, that's a whole different timeline. And by the time that might be happening, we'd be handing them off.
Obviously, that's the case, Tom. I wasn't asking that. I was asking if you're open philosophically to the idea that maybe it's time for a change, that maybe we need to rethink the way in which we're financing parks and running parks. That's all. If you're open to the idea. Is labor open to the idea?
We're open to anything that provides services to people and takes care of the workers.
See,
I mean, seriously, Randy, I don't want to work yourself out of a job, but why is there even a Parks Foundation? It's one of the most valued assets in the city when you poll taxpayers. Why shouldn't the general fund be able to pay
well,
for it?
let's be careful of our terminology here. The Parks Foundation is different than Portland Parks and Recreation. You know, we're
Right.
a 501c3 nonprofit that raises money for parks amenities, and in this case is helping with the campaign. You know, so we have a very, very specific charge. I think that the larger question of you know, should there be, you know, a different solution? And I'd be skeptical of regionalism on that level, and I'm a regional guy. I believe in regional government, but I still would be skeptical of it. But that said, you know, the importance of this levy is, I mean, basically, if it doesn't pass, it's almost like our school system. You know, we're going to see a generation of kids who are going to be demonstratively affected, you know, by what is going on in the schools. And do we want to leave, you know, those families and those kids out of parks as well? I mean, I think Andre, you know, has some real frontline experience with, you know, exactly what the system does, you know, for kids. If you want to talk a little bit about that, Andre.
Well, before Andre does.
Oh, you're muted. Sorry.
Go ahead, Mark. No, I was just going to say, while that's true, a part of me does echo Mark's idea about how are we going to come out of this in a way that is going to have a long-term sustainable benefit. And I can't ignore the fact that this levy is to get us, hopefully give us the resources to get to that place. You know, it's hard to make decisions and changes in a moment of crisis because you're making it from a crisis standpoint. We got to get through this crisis. But in regards to the work that Friends of Noise has been doing in relation to Portland Parks and Rec, it's been invaluable. And a big part of this levy is to try and figure out an equitable way of redistributing not just wealth, but resources so that the kids who are directly impacted by not being able to go to school, not being able to come together the way they have been, the parks have been a refuge for that. So I definitely want to add my voice to the notion that there does need to be a systemic change in how we fund and how we allocate these resources. We're not in a position to make that change and to make those decisions right now. But I'd be surprised if, you know, members of the city council that are coming on board and some of the existing ones, hopefully they're thinking about that as well. I mean, we're talking about maybe changing the charter of our city council moving forward anyway. And if that happens, what kind of impact will that have if there isn't a parks commissioner? How do we get more people involved, more people engaged? And we think that this levy is a step in that direction.
Randy, I have a question. I'm not sure if can you hear me?
Yeah.
Great. I want to follow up on one of Mark's questions. It was sort of a sub-theme of Mark's question, but I think it's important, which is the park system, along with being, I think everyone in the room would agree, a very valuable asset to the city, a gem, but it's also an incredibly popular asset. And so when Mark asked the question, why is there even a Parks Foundation? I think, and he can correct me, what he's driving at is, how is this intensely popular thing underfunded by City Hall? How can it not get a larger share of the general fund budget? Whereas, and I am speaking from what I see in polls, something like half of the people who live in Portland will be happy if we had like 2 cops.
Let me sort of parse that question a little bit.
How is it that the public safety bureaus continue to eat your lunch?
Well, I don't
I
know.
mean, I was,
You know, Tom, you want to take that? I feel like it's a little above my political grade.
Oh, come on, we're all big boys and girls here. We know what the answer to that is. It's because you're so popular. Put a levy out to raise money for Portland police and see whether or not, you know, they have any money for guns. I mean, that's a given. It's unfortunate, but it's true.
I kind of want to just step back and talk about the current financial situation we're dealing with, which is, you know, some of the pressures that we're dealing with have to do with the loss of revenue because the community centers are basically closed. But if you look at where that revenue would need to be backfilled from, which is the general fund, I mean, I just finished dealing with a large concessions package for our workers in PBOT and our folks at Parks and BES because the general fund in the city of Portland had a projected $75 million deficit. And what we know going forward is that some of the projections in the city budgets that were put out around March and April are actually worsening a little bit. So for us to be able to walk away and say, hey, the city needs to reprioritize their resources, this is a very difficult environment to do that in. And, you know, that's part of my job is that I go and I advocate for resources, specifically within Parks Bureau, where we have our members. So the landscape right now for coming out and shifting large amounts of money in the city to parks, I don't see that happening in the next 2 to 3 years with what the city budget is facing. And because this is such a general fund dependent bureau, that's where those resources would need to come from. And that's also where we're seeing some of our largest losses. So I don't want to necessarily speak to the juxtaposition of the police department versus the parks, but just to kind of frame this in a larger framework, getting more resources into parks is going to be incredibly difficult in the COVID environment. And I think we also know what's coming too, which is that there's a lot of folks with a rent moratorium who are, that money is going to come due at some point, and the same for businesses. And when that happens, the city is going to be in even worse financial shape. So that's kind of, to me, when I'm looking at this measure, that's the landscape we're working in.
Great. Well, thank you. I think we unfortunately have one more to do at 5 o'clock, which we need to be ready for. Unless there's anything pressing that you all haven't shared with us, we'll thank you very much for a very thorough presentation.
Sure. You know, I just want to say one thing. You know, I mean, you know, we've known each other as colleagues. You know, and read each other for a long time, and you know, correct me if I'm wrong, and you know, we can debate this. But since I came here in 1990, I can't think of a money measure in which up or down is going to so demonstratively change livability here. If this goes down, our park system is going to be irrevocably damaged. It'll probably take years for it to dig out. And if it passes, we'll preserve what we have, and a lot more people are going to have access to it. So it's a heart and soul of the city thing.
Hey Randy, thanks for that observation. I wonder, could you email me the grid that you were looking at before that shows, I think you had a doomsday scenario.
Yeah, sure.
So I'd love to have that for our consideration.
Okay, we'll do.
Also,
njaquist at wweek.com.
Yep, got it.
Thank you all.
so we love looking at doomsday scenarios.
Yeah, thanks
you.
very much, everybody. Appreciate your
Yeah,
time.
thank you. Really appreciate the conversation.
Bye.
Okay,
Take care.
all right. Thanks, guys.
Mark and Nigel,
Nigel,
for a second.
Yeah, let me turn the recording off and